September 17th, 1944. If General George Smith Patton hadn't walked into that storm of bullets, 300 United States soldiers would have been slaughtered before sunset. Not wounded, not captured, slaughtered. The German machine guns had them pinned down completely. No cover, no escape, no hope. But the man they called Old Blood and Guts was about to do something so insane, so impossible, that witnesses would question whether they had actually seen it happen. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from behind the lines, safe in their headquarters miles away. George Smith Patton never commanded from behind anything, and on this particular September day in France, he was about to prove exactly why his soldiers would follow him into the gates of hell itself. The Third Army had been racing across France like a wildfire, town after town liberated, enemy after enemy crushed. George Smith Patton's tanks were an unstoppable force, and everyone knew it. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. They called him that crazy cowboy general. But on this day, the wildfire had hit a wall. A German stronghold outside the town of Aracourt had stopped the advance cold. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests positioned perfectly on high ground, and 300 United States soldiers caught in the open, desperately hugging the ground as bullets ripped through the air inches above their heads. They'd been pinned down for 4 hours, 4 agonizing hours. Men were dying. Medics couldn't reach the wounded. Officers were screaming into radios for artillery support, for airstrikes, for anything. The attack had stalled. The breakthrough had failed, and every minute they stayed pinned in that killing field, more German reinforcements were arriving. The company commander, Captain Robert Morrison, knew they had maybe 2 hours before a German counterattack would overrun their position entirely. 2 hours before, 300 United States soldiers would be wiped off the face of the earth. Then someone spotted the Jeep, a single Jeep, racing toward the front line at breakneck speed, not away from the fighting, toward it, through the artillery fire, through the smoke, straight toward the sound of machine guns that had been hammering away non-stop since dawn. "Is that General Stars on that Jeep?" a sergeant shouted. It couldn't be. No general would drive directly into a hot combat zone. Not like this. Not without infantry escort, not without tanks, not without... The Jeep skidded to a halt behind a destroyed farmhouse 200 yards behind the pinned soldiers. The door opened. Out stepped General George Smith Patton, pearl-handled pistols gleaming on his hips, polished helmet reflecting the afternoon sun. Boots shined to perfection despite the mud and blood of the battlefield. He stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, surveying the situation like a rancher examining his property. Bullets cracked overhead. Mortar shells exploded in the fields nearby. The air itself seemed to be screaming. Old Blood and Guts didn't even flinch. He walked up to the company commander's position, each step deliberate, unhurried. "Captain," George Smith Patton said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Why are your men lying on their bellies like scared rabbits?" Morrison stared at him in disbelief. "General, sir, we're under heavy fire from..." "I can see that, Captain. I'm asking why you're still pinned down. The objective is that ridgeline. That's where we need to be, not here cowering in the dirt." "Sir, we've tried 3 times to advance. The Germans have perfect fields of fire. We need armor support. We need..." George Smith Patton cut him off. "What you need, Captain, is someone to show you how it's done." And then General George Smith Patton did something that would be talked about for the next 80 years. He stood up, fully upright, in the middle of a battlefield, under direct fire from German machine guns. He straightened his helmet, adjusted his pistol belt, and began walking toward the enemy positions. Not running, not crouching, walking, like he was strolling through a park on a Sunday afternoon. 300 United States soldiers watched in absolute shock as Old Blood and Guts walked calmly into the storm of bullets. They could hear the rounds snapping past him. They could see dirt kicking up around his boots. Machine gun fire was converging on him from 3 different positions. Any second, he would be cut down. Any second, one of the greatest generals in the United States Army would be killed right before their eyes. But Old Blood and Guts was about to change history. This is what happened next. What those 300 soldiers didn't know was that General, George Smith Patton had received very clear orders just 3 hours earlier. Orders from the Supreme Commander himself. Orders that specifically told him to stay away from the front lines. September the 17th, 1944, 8th Army Headquarters. A meeting that would determine the fate of the entire offensive. General Omar Bradley had laid out the situation clearly. George, we're bogged down at Aracourt, strong German defensive positions. We're going to need to bring up heavy artillery, coordinate an airstrike, and launch a proper assault tomorrow morning. Earliest. George Smith Patton had leaned back in his chair, those famous eyes boring into Bradley like laser beams. Tomorrow morning? Tomorrow morning those boys will be dead. The Germans aren't stupid. They know we're stuck. They're bringing up reinforcements right now. We don't have a choice, Bradley replied. The position is too strong for a frontal assault without proper preparation. There's always a choice, Old Blood and Guts said quietly. And I'm not leaving United States soldiers to die while we prepare. George, Bradley's voice took on a warning tone. You are not to go up to the front yourself. That's a direct order. We can't risk losing you. The Third Army needs its commander. George Smith Patton had smiled, that dangerous smile his staff knew all too well. Of course, Omar. I'll stay right here where it's safe. 3 hours later, he was racing toward the sound of guns. Now, standing on that battlefield with bullets whipping past, George Smith Patton represented something those soldiers had never seen before. Here was a 3-star general, a man who commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, a man whose decisions shaped the entire war effort, and he was walking into machine gun fire like he was immortal. Captain Morrison and his men watched in frozen horror and awe. Every instinct screamed at them to yell at him to get down, to take cover. But something kept them silent. Something about the way Old Blood and Guts walked, the absolute confidence in every step, the complete absence of fear. It was hypnotic. George Smith Patton walked 20 yards into the open ground. Machine gun fire intensified. The Germans had spotted him. They knew they had a high-value target. Rounds were kicking up dirt all around him. His uniform jacket rippled as bullets passed within inches. He stopped walking, turned to face the 300 soldiers still hugging the ground, and he shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield with that parade ground authority that could be heard over explosions and gunfire. Come on, you sons of bitches! Do you want to live forever? It was a line he'd used before, a line that had become famous among Third Army soldiers. But hearing it here now, while he stood completely exposed under fire, it hit different. One soldier stood up, then another, then 10, then 50. Within 30 seconds, 300 United States soldiers were on their feet, charging across that open ground, screaming at the top of their lungs. Old Blood and Guts was leading them forward, pistols drawn now, firing toward the German positions as he advanced. The German machine gunners must have been absolutely stunned. They had had these Americans pinned for hours. Complete suppression. Total control of the battlefield. And now, suddenly an entire company was charging straight at them, led by a general who seemed to be immune to bullets. But could Old Blood and Guts really pull it off? The next 20 minutes would tell everything. Because what nobody knew yet was that the German positions were even stronger than the United States forces had realized. There weren't 3 machine gun nests. There were 7. And 2 of them were positioned specifically to create a crossfire on anyone attempting exactly what George Smith Patton was doing right now. The trap was about to spring. The charge started with pure momentum. 300 men who'd been pinned down in terror suddenly transformed into an attacking force. That's what George Smith Patton did to soldiers. He didn't just command them. He transmitted his own fearlessness directly into their bloodstream. The first German machine gun nest was only 100 yards ahead. Old Blood and Guts was covering ground fast, and his soldiers were right behind him. 75 yards, 50 yards. The machine gun fire was constant now, a solid wall of lead cutting through the air. A soldier 10 feet to Patton's left went down, then another. The casualties were mounting, but the momentum held, because George Smith Patton never slowed, never hesitated, never showed even a flicker of doubt. At 30 yards from the first bunker, something happened that Captain Morrison would describe in his after-action report as impossible, but I saw it with my own eyes. A German soldier rose from a hidden foxhole. directly in Old Blood and Guts' path. Range, 15 yards. The German had a clear shot with his rifle. He raised the weapon, aimed directly at General George Smith Patton's chest. George Smith Patton saw him, made eye contact, and kept walking forward, his pearl-handled pistol coming up smoothly. 2 shots fired simultaneously. The German's round missed. How, nobody could explain. At 15 yards, with a clear shot, an experienced German soldier had missed. Old Blood and Guts' round did not miss. The German fell backward into his foxhole. George Smith Patton stepped over the position and kept advancing. Didn't pause, didn't take cover, just kept walking forward like he was on a training exercise. That's when I knew, Morrison would say later, that we were following someone who wasn't quite human. No man walks through fire like that. But Old Blood and Guts wasn't just a man. He was something else entirely. The first bunker fell when United States soldiers flanked it from both sides while German attention was focused on the advancing general. 3 Germans surrendered immediately. The machine gun went silent, but now the trap revealed itself. 2 more machine gun positions opened up from unexpected angles. The crossfire Old Blood and Guts had walked directly into. The killing zone they'd prepared specifically for this moment. Suddenly, the advancing Americans were caught in overlapping fields of fire from positions they hadn't even known existed. Men started dropping fast. The charge faltered. Soldiers dove for whatever cover they could find. Shell craters, destroyed vehicles, even the bodies of fallen comrades. The momentum that had carried them forward was evaporating under the concentrated fire. This was the moment when the attack should have failed, when the casualties should have become unsustainable, when any sane commander would have ordered a retreat to regroup. George Smith Patton kept walking forward. He'd spotted the 2 hidden positions now, identified exactly where the fire was coming from, and he made a decision that Captain Morrison described as tactically insane but somehow brilliant. Old Blood and Guts turned and walked laterally across the battlefield, perpendicular to the German guns, drawing their fire, making himself the obvious target while his soldiers found cover and prepared to flank the positions. Every German machine gun shifted to target him, both positions. Concentrated fire from multiple weapons, all focused on one man walking calmly through the storm. The amount of lead in the air around General George Smith Patton in those 30 seconds would have shredded a tank. Tracer rounds drew lines through the smoke directly at him. The sound was like 1,000 angry hornets. The dirt around his boots erupted in a continuous spray as rounds impacted. He kept walking. A bullet clipped his helmet, spun it sideways on his head. He reached up with his left hand, straightened it, and kept walking. Another round tore through his jacket at the shoulder, ripped the fabric clean through. Didn't touch skin. He didn't even look down. This was why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Not because he was reckless, but because he understood something about leadership that no classroom could teach. He understood that soldiers will follow a man they believe is invincible. And in that moment, walking through fire without flinching, George Smith Patton was creating a legend that would carry his army through 100 more battles. While he drew fire, his men moved. Professional soldiers of the Third Army, they'd trained for this. Flanking maneuvers, fire and movement, coordinated assault. But they could only execute because Old Blood and Guts had given them the time and space to get into position. The left machine gun nest fell first. A squad came at it from the blind side, while the Germans were fixated on Patton. Grenades silenced the gun. The right position lasted. Another 2 minutes before it was overrun. Suddenly, the battlefield went quiet. The German defensive line had been shattered. 300 United States soldiers had broken through a position that was supposed to hold for days, and they'd done it in 20 minutes. All because General George Smith Patton had walked into machine gun fire without flinching. When Captain Morrison finally reached Old Blood and Guts' position, the general was calmly reloading his pistols. Not a scratch on him, despite the torn uniform and dented helmet. Morrison would later tell reporters, "I counted at least 30 bullet holes in the ground within a 6-foot radius of where he'd been standing. 30 holes. And not one hit him. I don't know if I believe in miracles, but I saw one that day." George Smith Patton looked at the exhausted, blood-covered soldiers gathering around him. "You see, gentlemen," he said, voice carrying that theatrical quality he was famous for, "the Germans can't shoot for shit. Now let's take that ridgeline before they remember they're supposed to be fighting a war." The soldiers laughed. Actual laughter on a battlefield where minutes before they'd been facing annihilation. That was the Patton effect. Old blood and guts could take men who'd been frozen with fear and transform them into warriors who believed they were invincible. But the German commanders watching from the ridgeline weren't laughing. They were having a very different reaction to what they had just witnessed. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Weber was commanding the German forces at Aracourt. A veteran of the Eastern Front, he'd fought the Soviets at Stalingrad, survived the retreat from Moscow. He'd seen everything war could throw at a man. But watching through binoculars as an American general walked through concentrated machine gun fire without taking cover, that was something new. Was sold a sign? What is that supposed to be? He said to his adjutant. Is he trying to get killed? Is he insane? His adjutant, Captain Klaus Richter, lowered his own binoculars. His hands were shaking. Sir, that's Patton. That has to be Patton. Only he would do something like that. Weber felt cold fear settle into his stomach. Every German commander on the Western Front knew about George Smith Patton. The intelligence briefings were very clear. Avoid direct engagement with Third Army if possible. Patton's forces moved faster, hit harder, and never stopped. The man himself was considered extremely dangerous, not because he was particularly brilliant strategically, but because he was absolutely unpredictable and his soldiers worshipped him. If that's Patton, Weber said slowly, then this sector is about to become hell on earth. Get on the radio, tell Division we need reinforcements immediately, and prepare for a full-scale assault. Too late. Even as Weber issued orders, United States tanks were already moving up to exploit the breakthrough old blood and guts had created. Artillery was being repositioned. More infantry was pouring through the gap. The careful German defensive plan was collapsing because one man had done the impossible. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. This is why the Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. George Smith Patton didn't just fight battles. He shattered enemy morale through sheer force of personality. The ridgeline fell by sunset. The German forces retreated in disorder. What was supposed to be an impenetrable defensive position had been taken in less than 6 hours, with casualties far lower than anyone had predicted. But the story wasn't over, because news of what General George Smith Patton had done was spreading through the Third Army like wildfire, and that was going to create a problem with his superiors that would explode within 24 hours. September 18th, 1944. Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight Eisenhower's office. The Supreme Commander was reading the after-action reports from Aracourt, reading them for the third time, because he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Omar," Eisenhower said, looking up at General Bradley, "please tell me this report is exaggerated. Please tell me that George did not actually walk through machine gun fire in the middle of a combat operation." Bradley's face was grim. "I've confirmed it with 3 separate sources, including the German prisoners we took. They all tell the same story. George led a frontal assault personally, on foot, under direct fire." Eisenhower set down the report, rubbed his temples. "I specifically ordered him to stay away from the front lines. Specifically, those were direct orders." "When has that ever stopped George?" Bradley replied. Eisenhower couldn't help but smile slightly despite his anger. "Never, not once in 30 years. But damn it, Omar, we can't afford to lose. Him. The Third Army needs him. The entire offensive needs him. If he'd been killed yesterday, but he wasn't," Bradley interrupted. "And he broke a German defensive line that would have cost us 3 days and 1,000 casualties if we'd done it by the book. Say what you want about his methods, Ike, but they work." That was the impossible truth about General George Smith Patton. His methods were often insane. They violated every principle of officer safety. They gave his superiors heart attacks, but they worked. Old blood and guts got results that nobody else could achieve. Eisenhower knew he should reprimand him, should possibly even relieve him of command for directly disobeying orders. But he also knew what would happen if he did. The Third Army would revolt. Patton's soldiers were fanatically loyal, and every German commander from here to Berlin would breathe a sigh of relief to hear that the crazy American general had been sent home. "Get him on the phone," Eisenhower said finally. 20 minutes later, George Smith Patton's voice crackled over the secure line. "Good morning, Ike. Beautiful day for killing Nazis, isn't it? George, Eisenhower's voice was ice cold. "I ordered you to stay away from frontline combat. I was very clear about that." "You were indeed, Ike, very clear. And yet you personally led an infantry assault under machine gun fire. Care to explain?" There was a pause. When Old Blood and Guts spoke again, his voice had lost the theatrical quality. It was serious, almost soft. "Ike, I had 300 boys pinned down. 300 United States soldiers who were going to die if somebody didn't do something. I wasn't going to sit in headquarters and wait for the perfect plan while those boys died. I'm sorry I disobeyed orders, but I'm not sorry I saved those soldiers' lives." Eisenhower closed his eyes. That was the thing about George Smith Patton. For all his swagger and profanity and theatrics, underneath it all was a genuine love for his men. Old Blood and Guts would take any risk with his own life, but he was ferociously protective of his soldiers' lives. "The official record," Eisenhower said carefully, "will show that you were conducting a routine inspection of forward positions and happened to be present when an opportunity for an attack emerged. You took advantage of that opportunity in a manner consistent with aggressive leadership. Is that understood?" A long pause. Then Patton's voice, with barely suppressed laughter. "Perfectly understood, Ike. Won't happen again." "Yes, it will. We both know it will. Just try not to get killed doing it. The United States Army needs you alive." "I'll do my best, sir." After the call ended, Bradley looked at Eisenhower. "You let him off completely." "What choice do I have?" Eisenhower replied. "George Patton is impossible to control, impossible to predict, and gives me more headaches than the entire rest of the Allied command combined. He's also the best combat commander we have. Maybe the best combat commander anyone has. The Germans are terrified of him, Omar. Genuinely terrified. That's worth more than 1,000 perfect plans." He was right. German intelligence reports captured later in the war showed that Wehrmacht commanders were specifically instructed to avoid engagement with Third Army units when possible. One report, written by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt himself, stated, "Where Patton is, expect the impossible. Standard defensive doctrine does not apply. He will attack from directions you believe impossible, at times you believe improbable, with forces you believe insufficient. Recommend maximum reinforcement and prepared withdrawal routes." That's what General George Smith Patton had become by September of 1944. A psychological weapon as much as a military commander. The legend of Old Blood and Guts. Walking through machine gun fire just added another chapter to a reputation that was already legendary. But for the 300 soldiers at Aracourt, it wasn't about legend or reputation. It was personal. Corporal James Mitchell from Kansas had been among those pinned down that day. He would later tell his grandchildren, "I was ready to die. I'd made peace with it. We all had." Then Old Blood and Guts showed up and walked into hell like he owned the place. And suddenly dying wasn't an option anymore. Because if the general wasn't afraid, how could we be? We followed him because he made us believe we were invincible, just like him. That's what leadership looked like in its purest form. Not orders from a distant headquarters, not carefully calculated risk assessments, but a man standing up in front of his soldiers and saying through his actions, "I will never ask you to do anything I wouldn't do myself. I will never send you anywhere I wouldn't go first." George Smith. Patton had shown his men that their general would walk through machine gun fire for them, and they would never forget it. The story of Old Blood and Guts walking through enemy fire spread through the Third Army within 48 hours. Every soldier had heard it. Many didn't believe it at first. It sounded too much like propaganda, too perfectly dramatic to be real. Then they talked to the soldiers who'd been there, heard the first-hand accounts, saw the dented helmet that Patton wore for the next week, refusing to replace it. "Why would I replace it?" he'd said. "The Germans tested it, and it held up fine." Morale in the Third Army went through the roof. Soldiers who'd already considered themselves elite now believed they were unstoppable because their commander was unstoppable, because Old Blood and Guts had proven that fear was a choice, and he chose not to feel it. The German reaction was equally significant. Captured German officers were interrogated about Aracourt, and their responses revealed something fascinating. Lieutenant Colonel Weber, who'd watched the assault through binoculars, told interrogators, "We knew we couldn't stop Patton, not after that. You can defeat tactics, you can counter strategy, but you cannot defeat a man who has no fear of death." and you cannot defeat soldiers who follow such a man. United States newspapers eventually got hold of the story, though military censors kept some of the more dramatic details classified until after the war. But enough got through. The American public already loved George Smith Patton, the tough-talking, pistol-packing general who looked like he'd walked out of the Old West. Now they had another story to add to his legend. The New York Times ran a story in late September. General Patton's Third Army breaks German line. The article didn't include the specific details of his personal involvement. Censorship wouldn't allow it, but the message was clear. Where old blood and guts went, the Germans ran. Among military historians, the debate began immediately and continues to this day. Was George Smith Patton's action at Aracourt brilliant leadership or reckless grandstanding? The critics argued that he'd taken an unacceptable risk, that a three-star general had no business exposing himself to direct fire, that if he'd been killed, the entire Third Army's command structure would have been thrown into chaos at a critical moment in the war. They weren't wrong. By every rule of military doctrine, George Smith Patton should have coordinated the attack from a command post, should have sent in his officers to lead the assault while he managed the broader tactical picture. But the defenders of old blood and guts pointed to results. The position fell in 6 hours instead of 3 days. Casualties were 70% lower than expected, and the psychological impact on both United States and German forces was immeasurable. Third Army. Soldiers believed they could do anything. German soldiers believed resistance was futile. General Omar Bradley, who'd often clashed with Patton over his methods, wrote in his memoirs, "George was impossible, absolutely impossible to control or predict. But when United States soldiers needed inspiration, when they needed someone to show them that courage wasn't just a word, old blood and guts delivered, every single time." Even Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander who famously disliked Patton, admitted years later, "I thought George was a cowboy, a showman, too theatrical for proper command. Then I saw what his theatrics accomplished. His soldiers would follow him anywhere. Mine respected me. His loved him. There's a difference." The long-term impact on the war was substantial. The breakthrough at Aracourt opened up the entire region. Third Army tanks poured through the gap, racing toward Germany. Towns fell in rapid succession. The German armies hit as east. France was in full retreat by early October, and everywhere the Third Army went, the legend of George Smith Patton went ahead of them. German civilians reported that Wehrmacht soldiers would sometimes abandon positions when they heard Patton's forces were approaching. Not always. There were still plenty of fanatical defenders, but the psychological edge was real. One captured German soldier, interviewed in December of 1944, put it this way: "We were told the Americans were soft, that they wouldn't fight hard. Then we met Patton's army, and we understood that some Americans were different. They fought like devils, because their general was the devil himself, and he'd convinced them they couldn't die." The United States War College still studies the Aracourt assault today. It's taught as a case study in leadership under fire, though with heavy caveats about not encouraging general officers to expose themselves unnecessarily. The official lesson is, Patton's methods worked for Patton, but they're not recommended for everyone else. What the textbooks can't quite capture is the feeling in that moment. The 300 soldiers watching as old blood and guts stood up and walked calmly into certain death. The way their fear evaporated and was replaced by something else. Confidence, aggression, the absolute belief that they were following someone special. That's the intangible quality that makes George Smith Patton studied 80 years later. Not just his tactics or strategy, but his understanding of human psychology. His knowledge that soldiers need more than orders. They need inspiration. They need to see courage demonstrated, not just commanded. September 17th, 1944, a date that 300 soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. The day their general proved he was willing to die for them, and in doing so, showed them how to live. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. Not because George Smith Patton was reckless, though he was. Not because he loved war, though he did. But because when it mattered most, when United States soldiers needed someone to lead them through hell, he stepped forward without hesitation. The story of Patton walking through machine gun fire at Aracourt became one of the defining moments of World War II. Not because it changed the strategic situation, it was a relatively small engagement in the grand scope of the war, but because it perfectly captured what made Old Blood and Guts different from every other commander in the field. Modern historians debate whether George Smith Patton was the greatest general of World War II. The British have their arguments for Montgomery. The Soviets point to Zhukov. The Germans had Rommel and Manstein. The arguments will never end. But ask which general inspired the most absolute loyalty from his troops, and there's no debate. Old Blood and Guts wins that question unanimously. His soldiers didn't just respect him, they worshipped him. They believed that following George Smith Patton made them invincible. And on September 17, 1944, he proved they were right. The Pearl Harbor survivors who served under him, the D-Day veterans who fought across France, the soldiers who would later cross the Rhine into Germany, they all shared stories of Old Blood and Guts. The time he personally led a tank attack, the time he visited field hospitals and wept over wounded soldiers, the time he stood on a tank and directed traffic during a massive traffic jam while under artillery fire. Every story reinforced the legend. Every action proved that General George Smith Patton was exactly who he appeared to be, a warrior from another era, transplanted into the 20th century, leading modern soldiers with ancient principles of courage and honor. The United States Military Academy at West Point teaches his campaigns today, the tactics he pioneered in tank warfare, the speed and aggression that characterized every Third Army operation. The way he understood that in mobile warfare, confusion and momentum were weapons as powerful as artillery. But they also teach the leadership lessons, the way George Smith Patton understood his soldiers, the way he pushed them beyond what they thought possible, but never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, the way he created a culture of excellence and aggression that made the Third Army the most feared force on the Western Front. Captain Robert Morrison, who witnessed the walk through enemy fire, was promoted to major after Aracourt and served under Old Blood and Guts until the end of the war. In 1978, he gave an interview where he was asked, "Was General Patton the best commander you served under?" Morrison's response, "Best? I don't know if that's the right word. He was demanding. He was profane. He was sometimes cruel in his push for perfection. But he was ours, and we knew, every single soldier in the Third Army knew, that Old Blood and Guts would die before he'd let us down." After you see your commanding general walk through machine gun fire to lead you personally, what wouldn't you do for him? We'd have followed George Smith Patton to Berlin and back. Hell, we'd have followed him to Moscow if he'd asked. That's the legacy, not captured in textbooks or tactical manuals, captured in the hearts of the men who served under him. The Germans never forgot either. After the war, several high-ranking Wehrmacht officers were interviewed about Allied commanders. Their assessments were brutally honest. They had nothing to lose by then, and they were soldiers discussing their profession. Almost unanimously, they identified George Smith Patton as the most dangerous Allied commander, not Eisenhower, who managed the grand strategy, not Montgomery, who was technically proficient. Patton. Because Old Blood and Guts didn't fight predictable battles. He attacked when and where he shouldn't be able to. He moved faster than should be possible, and his soldiers fought with a ferocity that suggested they believed they were invincible. One German general, interviewed in 1952, said, "We could plan for Eisenhower, we could predict Montgomery, but Patton was chaos. He was a tornado. You just tried to get out of the way and hoped he would go somewhere else. The man had no fear, and fear is what keeps soldiers alive. Without it, he was unstoppable." The day General George Smith Patton walked through enemy fire at Aracourt, he cemented his place in military history. He proved that leadership isn't about staying safe in headquarters. It's about being willing to face everything you ask your soldiers to face. He proved that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to act despite fear. He proved that soldiers will follow a leader they believe in, even into the gates of hell itself. And he proved why they called him Old Blood and Guts, a nickname that started as criticism from those who thought he was too aggressive, too cavalier with lives. But that became a badge of honor, because Old Blood and Guts meant someone who fought from the front, who bled with his soldiers, who never asked for sacrifice he wouldn't give himself. September the 17th, 1944. 300 United States soldiers were pinned down and facing annihilation. One general refused to accept their deaths. He stood up, walked into machine gun fire, and led them to victory. That's not just military history, that's the stuff of legend. And that's why, 80 years later, we still tell the story of the day George Smith Patton walked through hell without flinching. Because it reminds us what true leadership looks like, what true courage looks like, what it means to lead from the front, no matter the cost. The Third Army would go on to liberate thousands of towns, would fight in some of the most brutal battles of the war, would cross the Rhine, push deep into Germany, and help bring the Third Reich to its knees. But for the soldiers who were there on September 17, 1944, the memory that defined their service was simpler. The day they watched their general choose to die rather than abandon them. And the day they chose to follow him into hell because he'd proven he was worth following. That's the legend of old blood and guts. That's the legacy of General George Smith Patton, a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon in warfare isn't a tank or a bomb. It's courage that inspires courage in others. If this story of how George Smith Patton walked through machine gun fire and led 300 United States soldiers from certain death to victory moved you, hit subscribe. We're bringing you more untold moments from the life of General George Smith Patton, history's most fearless combat commander, because old blood. And Guts lived 100 stories like this, and every one of them proves why he became a legend. The day he walked through enemy fire without flinching, General George Smith Patton showed the world what it means to be a warrior, what it means to lead, what it means to choose courage when every instinct screams for safety. 300 soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing that day, but they never forgot it, and neither should we.